The commander of the USS Gwin, DD-433, an American Gleaves-class destroyer, Lieutenant Commander John Benjamin Fellows, stood on the bridge, attempting to peer into the darkness before dawn. Only the phosphorescent wakes of the convoy ahead of his ship were visible to him, ahead of the bow. On July 13, 1943, just after midnight, the Central Solomon Islands, which are located about 650 miles south of the equator, were still scorching despite the darkness. Only the ship's motion through the night air provided the crew on deck with any kind of cooling relief from the oppressive humidity. The crewmen below were drenched in sweat, particularly the members of the Black Gang who were working on the engines in temperatures that were well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody knew that it would be their last day on Earth for many of them and their ship. However, we are overly optimistic. Gwin was the third ship to bear the name of Lieutenant Semder, William Gwin, a Civil War naval officer. She was put into service in January 1941 after being constructed at Boston's Charlestown Navy Yard. She also had a lot of weapons. Gwin possessed 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 5 40mm twin anti-aircraft guns, and 5 Mark 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns. Her maximum speed was more than 37 knots, and her range was 6,500 nautical miles. Gwin was 348 feet long, 36 feet at the beam, and displaced 1630 tons standard, just like every other member of the Gleaves class. She had already been on sea duty in the Pacific for 15 months. She had a crew of 11 officers and 201 enlisted ranks on this particular day, which is roughly equivalent to an infantry rifle company. John Fellows was an experienced and capable leader, born approximately 45 miles northwest of Boston in Fitchburg, Massachusetts. He received his degree from the U.S. Prior to joining the destroyers USS Talbot, DD-114, Warden, DD-352, and Crowning Shield, DD-134, he had been aboard ships including the cruisers USS Chester, CA-27, and Chicago, CA-29. He joined the Naval Academy in 1931, a full 10 years before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Fellows took over as the Gwin's engineering officer in October 1940. He quickly rose to the position of executive officer and eventually commanding officer. Gwin had been assigned to the Atlantic Squadron to patrol the waters surrounding Iceland when the war started, but he was later moved to the Pacific. Following the aircraft carrier USS Hornet on her disastrous mission to launch the Doolittle Raiders on their air raid against Tokyo on April 18, 1942, the ship took part in one of the most famous actions to date in the war. So far, however, she had neither heard nor fired an angry shot. That time was not far off. In order to bolster the defenses of Midway Island, Fellows and Gwin left Pearl Harbor on May 23, 1942, accompanied by a Marine Commando squad. After that, she rushed to join the Fast Carrier Task Force, which was attempting to stop a strong Japanese fleet that was advancing on Midway. But she didn't get there till the conflict was nearly done. Gwin's officers and men arrived on June 5 during the last stages of the action and were informed of the American victory. Roughly 250 enemy planes had been splashed, and 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk. However, the American carrier USS Yorktown, CV-5, was in danger of sinking after suffering significant damage from torpedoes and aerial bombs. Another rescue ship, the destroyer USS Hammond, DD-412, was also assisting with the salvage and firefighting efforts when, at approximately 3:36 p.m., a Japanese torpedo slammed into the Hammond in the vicinity of the No. 2 gun and exploded, breaking the ship's back. Gwin joined the Yorktown to do everything she could to save the carrier and her crew, but the flat top was torpedoed again on June 6th. The majority of the remaining crew members went over the side when the order to abandon the ship was given. Hammond left after 3 minutes. Gwin's salvage party risked their lives to try to save the Yorktown, but she started listing terribly, so Gwin's men had to give up. Nevertheless, they succeeded in removing 102 survivors from the sea. On June 10, 1942, Gwin went back to Pearl Harbor afterwards. On July 15, 1942, a month later, Gwin left Pearl and headed for the Solomon Islands chain's Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division needed all the assistance it could get to set up a beachhead and march inland before its August 70's invasion of Guadalcanal. That assistance was to come from the Navy. For both sides, the Solomons were strategically important. Japan would stop the United States from amassing the manpower and supplies in Australia required for MacArthur to advance north and retake lost territory, particularly the Philippines, if the Japanese were able to beat the Americans there. Australia itself would be suffocated to death, cut off from aid. As the Americans drew closer to Japan, the Japanese, on the other hand, knew that they would have little to stop them from recovering hundreds of islands if they lost the Solomons. Therefore, just as the Americans were determined to do everything in their ability to assure their triumph, it was imperative that the Japanese do everything within their power to prevent an American victory. As a result, following Midway, the Solomons battle emerged as the most significant conflict in the Pacific theater of the war. 19,000 Marines landed on Guadalcanal and Tulagi in the Florida Islands on August 7, 1942. The goal of the landings was to create a base from which the Americans could stop Japanese strikes on the supply line that connected the U.S. and Australia. The Marines nicknamed the Japanese airstrip at Lunga Point on Guadalcanal Henderson Field after seizing it during the battle. Regaining the lost land was a top priority for the Japanese, whose major base was located 650 miles to the northwest at Rabaul. The Japanese operated battleships and cargo ships under cover of darkness down the Slot, a short passage between Guadalcanal and San Cristobal Island to the south and Choiseul and Santa Isabel Islands to the north, in order to resupply and reinforce their forces dispersed throughout the Solomons. The Slot developed into the underwater superhighway that allowed their starved, overburdened garrisons battling on Guadalcanal and Tulagi to receive supplies and personnel from Rabaul and other locations. These nightly enemy supply missions were dubbed the Tokyo Express by the Americans. Because of the numerous sunken battleships that littered its floor, Savo Sound, also known as the Slot, was a shipping channel so hazardous that it also earned the moniker Ironbottom Sound. Under the command of Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan, the Americans formed cruiser-destroyer Task Force 67.4, flying the light cruiser San Francisco CA-38 to stop the Tokyo Express. One of the best officers in the Navy was Callahan. Prior to asking for sea service, he served as President Franklin D. Roosevelt's naval aide and as the head of staff to Admiral William Bull Halsey, Jr., commander of the South Pacific area. He would die as a result of the request. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto ordered Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe to bombard Henderson Field on Guadalcanal while aboard his flagship Yamato, which was anchored at Truk Lagoon. This was done so that a follow-up landing force of 12,000 men, led by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, could land and reinforce the garrison there without fear of an American aerial attack. Abe was given leadership of a powerful naval attack force consisting of 14 destroyers, a light cruiser, and 2 battleships, Kirishima and Hyai, in order to complete this objective. However, the Japanese chose to launch a hit-and-run aircraft strike prior to the ship's arrival. Task Group 67.1's commander, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, was himself in the process of resupplying and strengthening the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, which was nearing the end of its endurance after more than 3 months of combating not only the fervent Japanese, but also insects, disease, torrential rains, heat, humidity, festering wounds, and malnourishment. On the afternoon of November 12th, as Turner's ships were completing the process of dropping off new personnel and supplies at Lunga Point, they were unexpectedly assaulted by 32 torpedo bombers based at Rabaul and planes from the carrier Hio, which was positioned northwest. Turner positioned his ships in a defensive pattern to make them less susceptible to aerial attack, drew his transports away from the beach, and manned all the anti-aircraft weapons. Bombs and torpedoes dropped by enemy aircraft did minimal damage. U.S. Then, like flying knights, Henderson Field Marine aircraft ascended to engage in a lethal aerial joust. 31 warplanes were shot down by the American boat's gunners, who also took their toll on the Japanese. the pilot of a disabled Betty bomber decided to make his suicide dive on the San Francisco, killing or injuring 50 sailors and causing massive damage, but he was unable to bring the ship down. Although Turner's transports returned later that afternoon to complete offloading, few people thought the Japanese were permanently gone. Anxious lookouts searched the sea and the sky for any indication that the enemy would return. The Imperial Japanese Navy was indeed on its way, according to intelligence reports shortly after. Halsey informed Turner that Abe's flotilla was cruising for Guadalcanal, courtesy once more to the top-secret magic code breakers who pretended to be spies in the opposing team's huddle. Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid's Enterprise, CV-6, his only active aircraft carrier at the time, was being repaired at Noumea when Halsey ordered it to make the quick trip to Guadalcanal. Turner gave the order to stop offloading and divert the transports so they might seek refuge at Espiritu Santo. Task Group 67.4, led by Rear Admiral Callahan, waited for the Japanese to return. Callahan commanded 15 destroyers, 3 light cruisers, Atlanta CL-51, Juno CL-52, and Helena CL-50, and 2 heavy cruisers, Portland CA-33 and damaged San Francisco. In order to await the Japanese convoy, Callahan then positioned his ships across the notorious Ironbottom Sound, a 20-mile wide strait that separates Guadalcanal and Florida Island. At around 1 in the morning on November 13th, Abe's task force poured down the slot, past Savo Island, unaware that the Americans were preparing an ambush. The cruiser Helena's radar operators saw 2 groups of unidentified ships dead ahead 45 minutes later, despite the fact that there was no vision in the darkness. It was almost time for the first naval battle of Guadalcanal. As the gunners opened fire and the range closed, night gave way to day. Taken by surprise, Japanese ships used their searchlights to locate targets, which made them targets themselves. 10 minutes before 2 in the morning, the cruiser Atlanta, the flagship of Task Group 64.2 Commander Rear Admiral Norman Scott, was lighted by a Japanese searchlight. Atlanta used her 5-inch guns to fire toward the light, putting it out. However, the cruiser was targeted by Japanese destroyers due to the muzzle flashes, and a torpedo fired point-blank from the destroyer Akatsuki struck her, bodily lifting her out of the sea. When Callahan's flagship, the San Francisco, covered Akatsuki with return fire, the ship was sunk. In the midst of all the turmoil, a burst of shells from San Francisco, whose gunners were attempting to attack an enemy ship on the opposite side of her, unintentionally destroyed Atlanta's bridge. Atlanta was left dead in the water, while Admiral Scott and all but one of his staff perished. Later that evening, the cruiser would be scuttled. Munition tore back and forth across the shadowy strait over the next half hour, sending hot steel shards flying and ships to their destruction as the shells punched holes in bulkheads, crashed into bridges, and struck gun mounts. Their bodies were ablaze as men from both navies were blown into the sea or freely dove into the shark-infested ocean. There have rarely, if ever, been naval battles that were so fierce or destructive in such a brief amount of time. The two sides looked like boxers standing toe-to-toe and thrashing at one another while wearing blindfolds. Fuel oil, floating debris, and the mutilated mixed bodies of American and Japanese sailors quickly covered the strait's waterways. Flashes from numbers of guns and orange-colored balls of flame from projectiles that found their marks continued to light up the gloomy dawn. Admiral Callahan and Captain Casson Young, who received the Pearl Harbor Medal of Honor, were among the 77 members of the battleship Kirishima's crew who perished as the blazing San Francisco came under a barrage of fire. The severely wounded San Francisco continued to fight after Callahan and Young were killed, damaging the Japanese battleship Hiei and sinking a destroyer before being sunk by a B-17 flying out of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. In the midst of the combat, Boatswain's Matey First Class Reinhard J. Kepler battled fires and provided medical attention to the ships injured as Leighton CMDR. Herbert E. Schonland and Leighton CMDR Bruce McCandless kept the cruiser fighting following Callahan's death. The Medal of Honor would be given to everyone, with Kepler receiving it posthumously. Portland, Helena, and Juneau sustained significant damage during the slugfest. The latter was sunk the following day by enemy submarine I-26, along with her captain, Lyman K. Swenson, and almost 700 sailors, including the 5 Sullivan brothers, Madison, Joseph, Francis, George, and Albert. The American destroyer fleet likewise suffered a particularly high cost, while Sterrett, DD-407, Aaron Ward, DD-483, and O'Bannon, DD-450, suffered significant damage. Barton, DD-599, Cushing, DD-376, Monson, DD-798, and Laffey, DD-459, perished. Despite being mistakenly bombed by friendly ships, Buchanan, DD-484, managed to stay afloat. Unaware of his good fortune, Admiral Abe, who was clearly losing his composure in the chaotic, dark battle, gave the order for his large ships to cut off contact and withdraw northward while his smaller ships screened the withdrawal. Yamamoto replaced Abe with Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo because he was so incensed at Abe for what he saw as a cowardly act. The battle for Guadalcanal continued, but what has also been referred to as the cruiser night action was at last over. The American sailors focused on putting out the fires and caring for their injured as the Japanese ships were brought out of range. Captain Gilbert C. Hoover of the Helena became the highest-ranking officer still alive when Admirals Callahan and Scott passed away. Both would later receive the Medal of Honor posthumously, and he assumed command of Task Group 67.4. Halsey, however, relieved Hoover of command and chastised him for deserting the Juneau survivors. Navy intelligence, whose cryptanalysts were still intercepting and decoding Imperial Japanese Navy communications, told Admiral Halsey that the enemy was already sending another force south, indicating that they had not given up on destroying Henderson Field and assisting the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal. Similar to Abe's flotilla the night before, this force was larger than any U.S. The Navy may get together. Yamamoto gave Vice Admiral Kondo the order to destroy Henderson Field and bolster the forces on Guadalcanal. He did this by boarding the battleship Kirishima with 2 light cruisers, Isuzu and Nagara, 5 heavy cruisers, Maya, Atago, Suzuya, Takao, and Kinagasa, as well as up to 11 destroyers and 23 troop transports. However, Halsey had limited resources to stop Kondo's Tokyo Express. His fleet of destroyers had been severely reduced, and the majority of his cruisers were either severely damaged or already engaged to fight elsewhere. Task Force 64, led by Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Ching Chong Lee, Jr., was the only truly effective force Halsey had left in the area to stop the Japanese after Callahan's task force was destroyed. It was made up of 4 destroyers: Gwin, Walker, DD-416, Benham, DD-397, and Preston, DD-379, as well as the battleships USS Washington, BB-56, and South Dakota, BB-57. The Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal will shortly involve all. John Fellowes Gwin, one of several ships operating out of the naval base at Espiritu Santo, was assigned to provide anti-aircraft and gunnery assistance for the Marines on shore, as well as supplies and reinforcements to the Marines engaged in combat on Guadalcanal and Tulagi. On Friday, November 13, 1942, Lee's task group encountered Kondo's army late at night. The Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, sometimes referred to as the Battleship Night Action, began when the American fleet first staggered aimlessly in the dark. A string of miscommunications and command errors gave the Japanese the advantage. One sailor referred to it as a barroom brawl after the lights have been shot out, and it was equally as ferocious as the combat that came before it, which has been dubbed the most furious surface action of the entire war. Maya and Suzuya, 2 Japanese cruisers, approached close enough to fire approximately 1,000 rounds at Henderson Field, destroying 2 fighters and 2 dive bombers and damaging 17 additional aircraft. Aircraft from Henderson Field, which provided the enemy with a thorough rundown, and Enterprise, which was 300 miles away, supported Lee's ships. Hiei was hit 4 times by aircraft torpedoes near Cape Esperance north of Savo Island, and then a 500-pound bomb dropped by a B-17 based in Espiritu Santo Hiei was mortally wounded and a prime target for more airborne assailants. By that night, the remaining crew had been removed by Japanese destroyers, and the ship sank 5 miles off Savo Island. The Americans put up a fierce fight. A flotilla of PT boats from Tulagi arrived on the site in the early hours of November 14th and scared off the Japanese bombardment force with their torpedoes. 12 Japanese transports were observed in the slot on their way to Guadalcanal at 8:30 a.m. Additionally, Enterprise search aircraft radioed the carrier a sighting of the bombardment group that had retired to the northwest off New Georgia, and the carrier promptly sent out another swarm of assault planes. The cruiser Kinugasa was bombed by warplanes at 10:14 a.m., which caused it to list and flood. Chokai, Maya, and Suzuya were forced to evacuate when other planes arrived an hour later and started bombing and strafing them. The troop transporters were then surrounded by bombs dropped by a group of Henderson-based B-17s, but they were not struck. The story was different for the dauntless torpedo bombers, who sank 6 and forced the others to quickly retire. As of the final count, the Japanese had lost 8 transports sunk or dead in the ocean, 1 battleship, Shiei, 1 cruiser, Kinugasa, and 17 aircraft. The Americans had lost 2 enlisted men, 4 officers, and 5 planes. The Japanese, however, were not readily convinced. Later that evening, they would be back. The destroyers Walk, Benham, Preston, and his Gwin were in a column leading the battleships that were roughly 5,000 yards astern at 13 minutes after midnight on November 15th, according to Lieutenant Dear John Fellows. South Dakota reported contact, bearing 330, range 16,300 yards. Gwin saw 2 cruisers with 355, thought to be of the Mogami type, with a range of roughly 14,000. South Dakota started shooting 6 minutes later. Gwin was directed to launch 2 star shell spreads to illuminate enemy cruisers under fire of U.S. battleships, while the other ships started shooting as well. 2 AA anti-aircraft salvos were fired at cruisers, but the range was too long for the gunfire to be useful for anything other than diversion. Started firing on the right-hand ship of what looked to be 4 destroyers and 1 cruiser, which were reportedly in column and circling Savo Island counterclockwise. One of the 2 cruisers on our starboard quarter is now flaming, and the other apparently retiring to the northwest. Fellows wrote in the ship's journal at 27 minutes after midnight. Waka has pulled out of the column to port and is burning. Benham and Preston continue to shoot at what seem to be destroyers. Savo Island obscures targets, making them extremely hard to identify. We hit the Ayanami with 2 consecutive salvos, Fellows wrote 3 minutes later. The target is responding with a single gun after firing 4 gun salvos. On our port quarter, a Kumo-type cruiser is firing upon us. 300 yards away, Preston exploded. Nearly around the same time, a 4.7 caliber bullet pierced the WW2 engine room's forward-starboard side of the ship, the Gwin. 6 men were killed on the top level, steam filled the engine room, and the crew was forced out of the gun mount 4 handling room when the shell burst near the control station. Guns 4 and 5 still have power and battle lighting, but general lighting is out. Fellows also pointed out that several of the tin fish had gone overboard, and that the safety links holding the torpedoes mounted on the deck had broken. Gwin remained in the battle despite floods in her forward compartments, smoke rising from her wounds, and her ripped decks covered in blood and corpses. Then Fellows felt his ship almost lift out of the sea and had to spin sharply to avoid colliding with the burning Preston. After we passed her, Preston's depth charges exploded right after and gave the ship quite a shaking up, Fellows wrote. After that, Gwin was hit, resulting in 2 600-pound depth charges on deck splitting open and a jagged 2-foot hole on her starboard side. Fortunately, they didn't blow up. Fellows stated that his ship is still firing at flashes in the lee of Savo Island, using guns 1, 2, and 5 at 34 minutes after midnight on November 15th. The cruiser firing on our port quarter has been sunk by one of the U.S. battleships. Coming from starboard, the torpedo crossed astern, missing the stern by roughly 30 yards. Benham is no longer in the formation. Before 1 a.m., Kondo momentarily sailed to the northwest to let his bombardment unit to approach and plaster Henderson Field because he thought, without proof, that the American force had been routed. Japanese lookouts suddenly learned that South Dakota and Washington were present. The American dreadnoughts responded with their main guns after the Japanese fired and threw torpedoes at them. After being struck by 40 to 5-inch and 9 16-inch shells, Kondo's flagship Kirishima was rendered inoperable. Nearly 200 seamen were shortly carried to their watery doom when she overturned and sank beneath the waters. After being rescued, Kondo was transferred to a different ship. The combat ended at dawn on the 15th, with heavy casualties on both sides. Many bloated bodies drifted in the sea, along with dead and burnt ships. South Dakota, bruised and beaten, and Washington unscratched, returned to Noumea. With the exception of the substitution of steam and steel for sail and wood, the action was similar to Nelson's engagement with the French and Spanish at Trafalgar in 1805. Benham had a large portion of her bow blown off, and 2 American destroyers, the Preston and Walkie, were sunk in the free-swinging battle against the stronger enemy force. The only destroyer to remain largely intact was Gwin, despite being badly wounded and having only 1 working engine. She started saving Benham's guys. The damaged Benham had to be abandoned. Her crew moved and subsequently scuttled after Gwin attempted to tow her back to Espiritu Santo at a reduced pace of 5 knots. The 2 sluggish ships made an appealing target. According to Lieutenant Commander Fellows, his ship fired on Benham with main battery at 5:45 p.m. before one salvo created a massive explosion that seemingly split the ship in 2 aft the stack. Other fires were started. Torpedo warheads seemed to be the source of the explosion. As the ship fell down amidships, the bow and stern rose up and touched. The survivors of the struggle hobbled back to their ports like 2 battered, bloodied, and fatigued boxers. The United States had lost 7 destroyers and the cruiser San Francisco in the 2 naval battles of Guadalcanal. Callahan, Admiral, had passed away. Damage had been done to South Dakota. 2 battleships, Kirishima and Hiei, 1 heavy cruiser, 2 destroyers, 11 transports, and 64 aircraft had been lost by the Japanese. In all, 1,732 sailors and airmen had been killed for the Americans. An estimated 2,000 soldiers were killed on the transports, while at least 1,900 Japanese sailors were lost. It was headed to Noumea, New Caledonia, for repairs, while Fellows' ship was hors de war. However, the damage to his ship was too great for local repairers to handle, so Fellows and Gwin left Noumea and headed 5,300 nautical miles to the shipyards at Mare Island, which is close to San Francisco, for a comprehensive overhaul. Fellows' cool and collected command of his ship during the tumultuous night combat earned him the Navy Cross, the Navy's second highest honor for valor, while he was on land. For his heroics on November 15th, another Gwin sailor, machinist's mate, First Class Earl C. Johnson of Manchester, New Hampshire, also won the Navy Cross. However, since he passed away from his wounds, the honor was given posthumously. Notwithstanding the casualties, the Americans were able to stop the Japanese from retaking Guadalcanal or shutting down Henderson Field. In hindsight, one of the Pacific War's pivotal moments was the naval battles of Guadalcanal. However, Gwin's battle was far from ended. After repairs and sea trials were successfully finished in early March 1943, and new crewmen were reporting on board to replace those who had been killed or injured, Gwin left Mare Island and joined a convoy that was headed for Pearl Harbor, arriving on March 28th. After that, Fellows' ship was given escort responsibilities, which brought her back to the Solomons and, on June 4, 1943, to Tulagi Island. Returning to combat on June 21st, Gwin traveled with Task Unit 32.8.3 to the Western Solomons and Rendova Island, sometimes known as the Malta of the Pacific, which is located 200 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. She reached Lunga Point 3 days later to start anti-submarine patrols, which included the northern side of New Georgia Island, which is occupied by the Japanese and looks like a fat comma. Task Unit 31.1.3, which included a variety of transports headed for assault landings on Rendova Island, was screened by Gwin and 8 other destroyers on June 29th. The American conquest of New Georgia, known as Operation Cartwheel, was to begin with this. On the following day, the U.S. To liberate the island from a small Japanese garrison, less than 300 men at Munda Point, the Army and Navy launched an operation. The defenders were easily overrun by the 43rd Infantry Division's 172nd Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army, and an accompanying unit of Solomon Island Commandos. Gwin also helped by firing at probable Japanese positions that were effectively concealed by jungle foliage while the troops were waiting ashore. He then remained watch to keep enemy aircraft at bay. Regretfully, at 7:06 a.m., Gwin was hit by Japanese gunfire from shore batteries on Rendova, which resulted in 3 fatalities and 7 injuries. 30 Japanese planes attempted to attack the invasion fleet that afternoon, but the majority were shot down. By taking 3 of the torpedo bombers out of the sky, Gwin's gunners contributed to the increase in the total. On July 1st, the Japanese persisted in their fruitless assault on the American beachhead at Rendova. Now that Rendova was safe, the Americans needed to cross the Blanche Channel and advance on New Georgia, which was only a few kilometers north of Rendova, to confront the Japanese. Despite the United States' best efforts, however, the Japanese managed to bolster their garrison on New Georgia and thwart American ground forces' attempts to move onto the Munda Point airport. The Navy was once again ready to stop the nightly runs of Japanese troop transports coming down from Rabaul, which was almost 500 miles to the northwest, while the infantry was struggling to survive in the foul jungle. With orders to steam through the Kula Gulf and drop 2,600 Imperial Japanese reinforcements at Vila Point on the southern coast of Kolombangara, a staging area for Japanese infantry, before crossing the Roviana Strait to reinforce the New Georgia garrison, one of those nightly runs of 10 destroyers sailed out of Buin on July 4, 1943. Rear Admiral Teruo Akiyama of the Niizuki was in charge of this convoy, which was known as the 3rd Destroyer Squadron. To stop Akiyama's force, a new task group, Task Group 36.1, directed by Rear Admiral Walden L. Ainsworth, was formed on July 4th. In order to escort 7 destroyer transports to Kula Gulf, northeast of Kolombangara, where they would land American troops at Rice Anchorage on the northern shore of New Georgia, Gwin and Radford, DD 4I-46, met up with 3 American cruisers, Honolulu, CL-48, CL-49, and the repaired Helena. The opposing naval forces were unaware that they were headed for a collision. On July 5th, just before 2 in the morning, Akiyama's 3rd Destroyer Squadron was spotted at a distance of about 25,000 yards, and the task group's radars came alive. However, 16 minutes before the American radar detected Akiyama's ships, Japanese radar had already detected Ainsworth's force. A salvo of 14 1036-pound Type 93 long-lance torpedoes was fired at a distance of 11 miles. One of these struck the American destroyer USS Strong, DD 467, at port amidships, with such force that it blew out both sides of her hull and nearly broke her back. The expiring Strong was also the target of Japanese shore batteries. The ship sank beneath the waves, saving all but 46 of her sailors. Fuel and ammunition were running low, and Rear Admiral Ainsworth was compelled to depart at early on July 5th, after conducting a strong cruiser bombardment of shore objectives at Vila. While the crew was withdrawing, the Gwin's men noticed a life raft from the sunken Strong that contained 5 sailors. They took them to Guadalcanal's harbor, south of Lengo Channel, where they were evacuated to the USS American Legion, APA-17. Then Gwin went back to work. The Japanese, meantime, were still working to force the Americans to leave the Solomons. The following evening, Rear Admiral Akiyama returned to Vila with a second echelon of infantry reinforcements, this time flying his flag above Niizuki. All hands hurried to their designated stations. As general quarters and battle stations were sounded on board, Gwin, at 10 p.m. on July 5th, On the 6th, at 42 minutes after midnight, Ainsworth informed all of his ships that radar had detected an enemy force consisting of at least 6 ships. Another fierce night battle, now known as the Battle of Kula Gulf, broke out between the two sides 30 minutes later. Admiral Akiyama was killed when the Americans struck and sank Niizuki in the first 5 minutes. The German destroyers identified Helena by her muzzle flashes and pounded her, despite the 3 American cruisers firing about 1,500 shells at the hostile force. Helena started to sink and spew oil after multiple torpedoes struck her side. As they continued to fire at the enemy, the destroyers Radford and Nicholas, DD-449, rescued her crew and started pulling over 750 sailors soaked in oil out of the water. The major action ended at 2:30 a.m. After successfully landing 1,500 troops in Vila, the Japanese departed for the north. The Americans retired too. Ainsworth led his forces out of Kula Gulf, believing that he had scored a decisive victory in the Pacific, a naval historian wrote. But according to the majority of historians, neither side really gained the upper hand, and the conflict was a draw. While the Japanese lost the destroyers Niizuki and Nagatsuki, American forces lost Helena, but they were still able to send almost 1,500 troops and 90 tons of supplies to Kolombangara. Before Helena keeled over and sank beneath the waters, Gwin and Woodworth returned to the combat site before daybreak on July 6th and rescued 87 sailors. Later, Fellows received a note from Captain Charles P. Cecil, the skipper of the doomed Helena. The crew of the USS Helena, whom you greatly assisted, would like to inform you that we will remember your ship and her crew as gratefully as we can for as long as we live. When the Gwin laid to wait for our boats that morning, you may be sure that everyone on the beach said at least a silent prayer. Words cannot express the weight that was removed from our hearts. However, that was by no means everything. Only your generosity could match the effectiveness of the attention we received on board. Everything was regarded as pretty normal at the time. Since then, we have questioned if we could have been treated as quickly and thoroughly by a much larger ship. As we honor a fighting ship that paused for a humanitarian gesture, please accept our deepest gratitude. Gwin stood out for Rendova Island to keep patrol on the 11th. The next day, she went back to Purvis Bay, refueled, and joined Task Group 36.1, which was once more under Ainsworth's command. This group had been reorganized and consisted of 10 destroyers: Gwin, Radford, O'Bannon, Buchanan, DD-484, Jenkins DD-447, Maury DD-401, Nicholas DD-449, Taylor DD-468, Ralph Talbot DD-390, and Woodworth DD-460, and Cruiser Division 9, Honolulu, St. Louis, and New Zealand Navy Cruiser, HMNZS Leander. Early on the morning of July 13, 1943, 13 ships entered Kula Gulf, with Lunti CMDR Fellows destroyer coming in 9th. Although their fate demanded a different function, their purpose was to defend the amphibious landings that had taken place on the northern shore of New Georgia a few days prior. Early on July 13th, more than 1,000 Japanese soldiers were loaded onto 4 transports as they descended the Slot from the Upper Solomons, escorted by 5 destroyers and 1 light cruiser, Jinsu. They were to land at Vila on Kolombangara, much like the last convoy. Ainsworth believed he had caught them off guard, but the Japanese convoy, led by Vice Admiral Shunji Izaki, knew the Americans were there and was ready to fight. As fierce and brutal as the struggle in the Slot the previous November, the two forces engaged in combat in the Kula Gulf about 1 a.m., roughly 20 miles east of Kolombangara's northern coast. The 3 Allied cruisers captured Jinsu under concentrated fire from their main guns and the destroyer's torpedoes, blowing her to pieces as the opposing destroyers ran around like pit bulls. Around 1:45 a.m., Admiral Izaki and the majority of her crew joined her in sinking. Both St. Louis and Honolulu, the latter being Ainsworth's flagship, were severely damaged during the battle, while Leander was rendered inoperable after being struck by a long-lance torpedo fired by one of the German destroyers. 26 soldiers were killed instantly, or reported missing from the boiler room and the gun mount right above it. The injured Leander had to leave the fight, escorted by Radford and Jenkins. Still scuttling around in the dark, the American destroyers played up to their reputations as bold and feisty, using 5-inch guns and torpedoes to shove at their Japanese rivals. Gwin was ahead of Honolulu, and in the thick of things. Fellows had to make a sharp right turn at 2:09 a.m. on the 13th to avoid another torpedo that was aimed at Gwin. But 5 minutes later, Gwin trembled as shards of her flew into the dark sky. She had been struck by a long lance torpedo in her port quarter, which knocked out her after engine room and steering gear. The main deck was submerged, and all radio transmitters were likewise disabled. According to the official Navy account of Gwin, 31 torpedoes were fired at the American formation by 4 Japanese destroyers who were waiting for a premeditated moment when Ainsworth's formation would turn. As they maneuvered to direct their main cannons against the enemy, his flagship Honolulu, cruiser St. Louis, and Gwin directly entered the path of the lethal long-lance torpedoes. Despite suffering severe strikes, both cruisers managed to survive. Gwin wasn't as lucky. It was a horrible sight when she was hit by a torpedo, amidships in her engine room, and detonated in a white-hot blaze. Men had been instantly slain in the destroyer's engineering spaces where the thunderbolt exploded, another Navy historian recounted. Others drowned in the rushing waves or perished in gusts of live steam while confined in damaged compartments. A team under the command of Ensign G.E. Stransky, USNR, made a valiant attempt to contain a raging oil and ammo fire. They were burned and blinded by the intense heat and stifling oil smoke, but they were able to put out the fire. After that, the 3 Allied cruisers that had been accompanied by Woodworth and Buchanan retreated, leaving Gwin alone with Ralph Talbot waiting to help. L'état casualties des Gergerais, Fellows calmly ordered his crew to battle the flames, but the battle to save the listing, burning, dead in the water, Gwin continued into the afternoon. He ordered the abandoned ship, and he and his crew went to Ralph Talbot. Fellows and crew watched with sorrow as the gallant Gwin was scuttled at 9:30 the following morning. As the destroyer poured shells into Gwin, the liturgy for burial at sea was delivered by someone on board, Ralph Talbot. Gwin was destroyed in 15 seconds, along with the bodies of 59 soldiers and 2 officers. Gwin had fought her final battle bravely, and her surviving fought back tears as they saw her go. "We knew she had been living on borrowed time, but she was a great ship," one of her crew members remarked. "We all lived through that period in the Solomons, I suppose." The cost of the Battle of Kolombangara was high. 89 Americans lost their lives, 61 of them aboard the Gwin. More than 480 Japanese people died, in addition to Jinsu and Admiral Izaki. However, the Japanese managed to land 1,200 soldiers at Vila and managed to escape with all of their warships. My heart is very full over the loss of our Gwin after her gallant fight against terrible odds. But again, you have evened the score by sinking 4 to 6 Jap ships, Admiral Ainsworth subsequently wrote to Gwin's commander. I want to say again how much I admire and respect each and every officer and man in our force for their capacity to fight. In the battle off Kolombangara, you have shown that you can accept it with a smile and wade in for more punishment, proving that you had no equals when it came to putting it out. We salute the repair parties and the Black Gang. To everyone, congratulations, and a more than satisfactory well done. The Silver Star was given to Commander John B. Fellows, Jr. for his leadership during the particularly difficult time. According to his award, he contributed to the sinking of 4 and likely 6 Japanese vessels by fighting his ship with deadly accuracy and unwavering determination. He oversaw the damage control with the highest bravery and effectiveness, and under his courageous leadership, he heroically toiled for 7 hours in a last-ditch but fruitless effort to preserve his ship. Following the engagement, Fellows returned to the United States, took a brief shore leave, and was subsequently assigned to command the recently commissioned destroyer USS Twiggs, DD-591. There was no more fighting for Fellows because, fortunately for him, she was a training ship, and he cruised with her out of Norfolk, Virginia until March 1944. However, Twiggs was not so lucky since she was struck by a kamikaze during the Battle of Okinawa on the evening of June 16, 1945, and she sank with all men. John B. Fellows, Jr. continued to serve in the Navy, serving in a number of capacities. His most recent position was Commander of the Mediterranean Sub-Area of the Military Sea Transportation Service, MSTS. He had a daughter named Santa and a son named Michael, with his wife Harda. Being proud that he and his ship had contributed to the Allies' victory in the war, he retired in 1959 with the rank of Rear Admiral and died on March 30th, 1974. According to one historian, the American victory in the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal effectively ended any hope the Japanese had of wresting control of the island back from the United States. Historians disagree on whether the outcome of the naval battles of Guadalcanal was a tactical victory for the Japanese or the Americans. Henderson Field would never again be the target of an Imperial Navy knockout attack. The Tokyo Express would never again be allowed to operate without consequence. The seas surrounding Guadalcanal, which is now, finally, American-owned, were secured by a traditional duel between two armored giants. And the soldiers of the Gwin, like with every other ship involved in the fights, had paid a heavy price in blood for the triumph in the waters surrounding Guadalcanal. Michael Fellows is a former American, Army colonel, Vietnam War veteran, former president of the Veterans Memorial Museum in Broomfield, Colorado, and son of John B. Fellows, Jr., the skipper of the Gwins.